So when we're thinking about our economic recovery, we do need to take an approach that takes on board the fact that we are dealing not with one crisis, but a number of crises. So it's economic recovery plus climate action, plus the need for biodiversity, nature sort of positive approach, as you said.
We all admire Singapore for its economic astuteness, for its planning. Well, their green growth plan envisages competitive advantage. It envisages the creation of jobs.
Globally, there are methods, the systems, instruments where you can reduce the methane emissions, and then the benefit to go to farmers as well.
To what extent can a nature-positive economic growth path chart a more sensible, meaningful, inclusive, and smarter way out of Sri Lanka's economic crisis? That's the focus of our first panel in this series that the Center for a Smart Future has teamed up with Echelon. And we're really privileged to have a great panel from three parts of this ecosystem. We have Dilhan Fernando, who is the chair of Dilmah, who bring the private sector perspective and frankly, a private sector leader who thinks a lot about these issues. We have Sonali, who is the country representative for the Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI, with a lot of experience in this space in Sri Lanka and many countries, and Dr. Anil Jasinghe, who was the former Secretary to the Ministry of Environment and now the CEO of the Climate Change Office and also an additional secretary at the senior additional secretary at the Presidential Secretariat. And he's been championing many of these issues at a very high policy level. So really what we want to do in this opening panel is to tease out your ideas on what does it mean to put nature at the heart of our economy, our economic growth model. Can it really be something that helps chart a better, smarter economic recovery? Because there's a lot of different ideas around what this economic recovery should look like. So perhaps I'll start with you, Sonali, about to what extent can these ideas around nature positivity, around green growth, really be that new growth driver or a different way of thinking about Sri Lanka's economic recovery?
Thanks very much, Anush, and thanks for this opportunity. So I guess I'd like to start off by saying that obviously the next 2 years for Sri Lanka is critical because we're going through this economic recovery. But we also need to take a step back and understand that globally, there are a number of crises that Sri Lanka as well as other countries are facing. So we can't just look at Sri Lanka's economic crisis in isolation. We do need to have a think about the fact that Sri Lanka is also extremely vulnerable to climate change. And it also is a biodiversity hotspot, which is under serious threat as well. So when we're thinking about our economic recovery, we do need to take an approach that takes on board the fact that we are dealing not with one crisis, but a number of crises. So it's economic recovery plus climate action, plus the need for biodiversity, nature sort of positive approach, as you said. I'd like to take a step back then and also bring to your attention the fact that myself from the Global Green Growth Institute, we work a lot on green growth. And in terms of what we mean by that is we're looking at a trajectory where countries are moving forward in terms of an environmentally sustainable and a socially inclusive growth pattern. Now, in terms of nature positive, and there is a lot of experts out there who are working on it at the moment. We had a discussion about this. The Oxford University Nature Positive Hub is one of them that I'm more familiar with. And it's really to ensure that in terms of nature positivity, there's a specific definition. And when we use that in the Sri Lankan context, we really need to understand what that means. So it is, as in the green growth approach. It's very much looking at putting nature at the center, but it's also looking at ensuring there's a positive gain. So the net gain of nature is, I believe, critical in the context of the nature positive approach. And in that context, there are a number of indicators that one has to bear in mind in terms of going forward to actually understand whether we are taking a nature positive approach moving forward. So similar to green growth, I believe the two concepts are complementary, and they're both looking at environmentally sustainable approaches to move the country ahead. And in my opinion, for Sri Lanka to actually recover from this economic crisis, we do need to very much move away from our earlier trajectory and think a little bit differently and, out of the box. And we need to really take on board these kinds of approaches, but ensure that we use them in the right way as well.
So, Dilhan, I think Sonali set this stage really nicely. And for you, to what extent do you think that this nature positive economy approach resonates with how you have been thinking about Sri Lanka's economic growth model, what needs to change about it? Perhaps what kind of influences have you had around, thinking about this and really considering all of that? Do you think it's possible? Do you think it is realistic to say that a nature positive approach could be a smarter way for Sri Lanka to think about its economic recovery differently to how perhaps we're thinking about it now?
Thanks, Anush. Well, Sri Lanka is abundant with environmental potential. From the tea industry, we have an asset in the fact that Sri Lanka is one of 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world. That means, of course, it's rich with endemic species, but also threatened. So when you consider the opportunity for Sri Lanka to chart a green growth pathway, I would say that we are well ahead of most of the Western nations for the simple fact that our economic development has been such that we have not wasted that natural asset. But I think where we lack is our understanding of the valuation. Now, the most recent valuation I could find of that asset was 138 billion. I think it was the University of Portland that talked of the combined assets. Of course, that's increased now. That was a very conservative valuation of our ecosystem services. But if I frame that within the tea industry and look at how we could chart our growth in the next 10 years, well, quite honestly, we are dealing with a customer that is increasingly sensitive, increasingly conscious, sensitive to the environment. It's not only Greta Thunberg in Gen Z and Gen Alpha that's following that is going to decide on their purchasing decisions in terms of what causes the businesses they support are supporting, and not just supporting, not words, but actions, tangible actions, because these people, this generation has access to information like never before. So I would say that Sri Lanka has an opportunity, but we need to understand the value of what we have, the value of the Singharaja, the value of integrating basic environmental or climate mitigation actions as GGGI and others propose. The potency in putting in something as simple as rainwater harvesting and help and using that to secure us against the drought that we face every year, that decimates our producers every year, is huge. But at the same time, taking green growth opportunities and looking at the inclusive growth we need is also critical. We have Dilmah, yes, we can say, yes, we have a high value addition, etc. Fantastic, but that's not enough to move the needle at a national level. So to do that, we need to bring in the Gotukola farmers, we need to bring in the seaweed farmers, we need to bring the micro and small entrepreneurs. And the best way of doing that is adding value to Sri Lanka's natural heritage, Ayurveda, which hinges on nature. Look at the pharmacopoeia in Ayurveda. If we nurture that and offer that to the world as a holistic healing method, that is one opportunity. But at the same time, If you consider, you talked about influences, consider the argument that Mariana Mazzucato in The Value of Everything. It's a very simple argument. Capitalism that does not understand that in addition to conventional economic capital, there should also be nurturing and sponsorship support for social and natural capital, it would be parasitic. It would be essentially stealing from the future. And for this, another influence, and these are two books that I encourage every business person to read, Mariana Mazzucato's Theory of or Value of Everything, and William McCaskill, What We Owe the Future. Now, in that beautiful phrase, he says, our future could last for millions of years or end tomorrow. He then comes to the nub of it. Billions could live happily or undergo unimaginable suffering depending on what we do today. So whether it is an economic argument, whether it is concerns our competitiveness, whether it concerns inclusion, economic inclusion that we need to be able to stabilize our nation, or whether it concerns the moral argument, there is a powerful argument and rationale for nature positive economy.
Dr. Jasinghe, Dilhan made this very strong argument on all these dimensions why we need to consider nature more strongly. Now, you have to deal a lot with policymakers at a high national policy level, where there are a lot of different pressures on the economy, a lot of pressures on decision making. So considering all of that, to what extent do you feel that an economic policy approach that puts nature at the heart of that, at the heart of the growth model, is possible at this point in time?
Thank you, Anush. It is possible. And the natural capital refers to the stock of, the nature, which is actually the forest, the biodiversity, and the biodiversity ecological services, ecosystem services. Now the thing is, of course, the crisis has brought up this discussion in front of us. But then even, otherwise, you could see that the world is, sort of maybe slowly, but then transforming into a green economy. Now, just to say a few things, why countries like Sri Lanka should concentrate on this path. One thing is fiscal deficit, right? We don't have the fiscal deficit for the way that we have been developing this country. And then, of course, it is estimated about 5% of GDP of small countries, goes on climate shocks, right? So that means unless otherwise we sort of go for this controlling climate shocks in mitigation and adaptation, we would be losing on the other hand. So these are the main reasons. And then, of course, having this natural capital, now especially Sri Lanka is located in the tropical belt. If you take tropical belt, it amounts to 40% of population, 40% of geographic area, surface of the globe. So this is, we call it the climate modulator. And then abundance of, the solar and wind power. And if you take in Sri Lanka, you could see the resources, the water and water reservoir, water, the rivers, the forest cover, and then the coastal ecosystem, blue ecosystem. So it's simply that we have not been able to tap into this natural capital and enough manner. even globally these concepts are now the certain concepts are coming up, and how that the how can this development couple with the economic in economic terms, and the instruments still are being developed. So therefore I think certainly countries like Sri Lanka can benefit a lot from charting on green growth.
And just to follow up, Dr. Jasinghe, I was just looking at the amount that the Sri Lankan Ministry of Environment over many years, for 20, 30 years, what they have been working on. So Sri Lanka has actually been quite a first mover in bringing forward legislation, laws, policies, and so on. Fast forward to today, yes, we have all of those, and now there's new efforts, for example, at the Presidency Secretariat to do more. But we still haven't perhaps seen that shift in the growth model. We saw post-COVID. I mean, you were Secretary, Ministry of Health at the time. You may have seen other countries were rethinking what a post-COVID economic model needs to be, rethinking our relationship with nature, and so on. Do you feel that that conversation is coming more now to the center of the economic policy discussions, or it's still kind of not yet there? It's still that environment and nature is still seen as a sector that is separate, like transport or energy, not really being thought in this.
Yeah, you are correct. Actually, in the past, it was economy against environment, right? And the sort of then only this sustainable development came into being, right? And then, of course, going beyond the green growth. As you said, the Environment Ministry, especially if you take last maybe 2 to 3 years, we have come up with enormous number of outputs, the instruments, right? From sustainable consumption production policy to the green procurement the framework to green labeling policy, and then the net zero, then the NDC plan, NDC implementation plan, just to name few. Right. So if you take Sri Lanka, what I see is actually the ground is ready, right? But we have to start the match. For some reason, maybe the weather or something, it is little getting delayed, which is I think usual for Sri Lanka. So if you take in the past, even the economies, say even you take the treasury or the CBSL, they were not at all thinking about in terms of the green growth. But then it was CBSL which first came up and went ahead with the green taxonomy, right? Which is a very important thing. But still, there are a lot of, things that we have to go beyond. Now that is the very reason why that climate change office is actually placed under the president. And now actually we are working on the organogram, the cabinet paper, and then Climate Change Act. Of course, act to get passed takes little time, but this is very, very important, because ultimately this green growth, which is not always adaptable to vast majority at the outset, but then they will join the bandwagon later. So you need to have overarching superior body. Of course, it was the Ministry of Environment which was doing this, but then to see that, when you get ministries, all sister ministries, and then sometimes, one ministry doesn't listen to the other ministry, and then you don't get that multi-sectoral coordination, which is once again, system ill in Sri Lanka, right? So therefore, I think right now, you can see that the economists more and more getting engaged in this green growth discussions with us, and then we also try to understand them, and they also try to understand us.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you mentioned, Dr. Jasinghe, because I mean, my formal training isn't as an environmental economist, but as an economist who thinks about Sri Lanka's overall competitiveness, overall macro stability. These are now increasingly issues that we have to consider because there's no delinking them. So I think I'm going to move on to our next round where from your own work, from each of you, from your own work and things that you've been involved in your organizations and roles, what are some of the specific initiatives or examples that you have seen where some of this is already happening? So perhaps, Sonali, to you, your work in many countries prior to Sri Lanka with GGGI, but also other organizations, what have you seen around countries who are doing this well, and also any initiatives in Sri Lanka that you feel are bright spots, are signals of some change that's happening?
Actually, just to say that in terms of GGGI, my portfolio is Sri Lanka. So taking a step back, I might just explain a little bit as to what GGGI is all about. So we are an international intergovernmental organization and really focusing on supporting developing countries and emerging economies to move towards a more inclusive, sustainable, and green growth model. So this conversation is really at the heart of what we actually do. And we have a number of, it's a member-based organization. So we have 48 members at the moment. Sri Lanka is actually one of the members. Sri Lanka became a member in 2019. And we've signed a host country agreement with the government in February last year, in 2023. So what we are really focusing on, I'm now just moving to what we do in Sri Lanka, is through our country planning framework, which is like a consultation with a number of different stakeholders, government as well as private sector, is understanding where GGGI can add value and support. And in that context, thinking about green growth, some of the sort of key thematic areas are in terms of, for example, renewable energy, sustainable transport, so looking at electric mobility, looking at climate action and building resilience, so working very closely with the Ministry of Environment, thinking of new innovative instruments like climate finance, so working with the Ministry of Finance, the Presidential Secretariat, as well as the Ministry of Environment. So these are some of the sort of key areas that we are working on in terms of green growth. Taking a step back in terms of what GGGI does globally, one of the key initiatives that we've done is actually support member countries in developing their green growth strategies, national strategies or national green growth plans. So in a number of countries, for example, in Jordan, in Laos, so because we work across the globe, there have been situations where, and also the UAE, where we have worked, I'm just naming a few, where we work closely with the government in a very consultative process, so bringing on board other stakeholders as well, in developing the country's green growth strategy. So now this strategy doesn't sit on its own. It's very much sitting within the framework of existing policies. So for example, the NDCs of the country, the national development plans, environmental plans, etc. So it's not like a standalone item, but really acting as an overarching framework. And it also looks at bringing in positive green growth strategies in different sectors. So again, bringing in that intersectoral integrated approach. And I believe this is one way in terms of ensuring that from a policy perspective, all these different policies that are focusing on nature and the environment, as well as climate action, can be drawn together and having like this sort of umbrella oversight in terms of the overarching green growth. Because green growth could be in many different thematic areas. It could be in renewable energy. It could be in nature conservation. It ranges. In terms of specific work that we are doing in Sri Lanka that I think would be interesting to talk about is in relation to, for example, sustainable finance. And GGGI is, since last year, working with not just the Ministry of Finance, but also looking at working with private banks and supporting them in developing their thematic frameworks to have issuances which are green in nature. So we're very pleased to be working with two banks at the moment, NDB as well as Commercial Bank. And this work is actually part of a big portfolio of work that GGGI is doing globally. We have a climate trust fund through the Luxembourg government that is actually supporting GGGI to help member states, providing them with technical assistance in developing these thematic frameworks and supporting them to bring it to issuances. And from a GGGI perspective, the idea is to bring in green investments into the country. So we're not just looking at any type of investment, but very much focusing on enhancing the green side of business in countries, including in Sri Lanka.
Right. So I think, Dilhan, we heard from some of the initiatives that are happening at a national policy level that signal something is changing. We've heard from Sonali around what intergovernmental organizations supporting the government, supporting the private sector are doing here in Sri Lanka, which also give us a sense of what's moving. From your experience in your own business, but also if you were to zoom out with the private sector at large, could you think of any specific initiatives or examples that really speak to this approach of nature gain, nature positivity, nature positive economic approaches? It's where it's going beyond just minimizing the damage, but actually putting nature at the heart of the competitiveness or the business model itself. You have a great helicopter view of the private sector, but also in your own business, you've been thinking a lot about these a lot. So examples.
Absolutely. I mean, there are several. I think the context is important. And the context today is we are confronting what the UN calls a polycrisis. So whether it is gender or whether it is inequality. And so whatever solution, whether it is a nature positive or any other solution, must embrace all of this. And I find that looking at what is happening around the world, it is nature positive and growth that is sensitive, that puts nature at the heart. That is the one that addresses each of those elements. I mean, you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you look at how we can address those, everything points back to nature. Practical perspective, people might react to this conversation and say, we're a bunch of greenies who are coming along and trying to propagate a different agenda. Well, look at Singapore. We all admire Singapore for its economic astuteness, for its planning. Well, their green growth plan envisages competitive advantage. It envisages the creation of jobs. And so I think in that sense, if you take an example like agroforestry has the ability to build regenerative forms of agriculture into our plantation environment, which is fundamentally unsustainable, but it is one that we have inherited. It's one that we can't afford to transform overnight, simply because the economics of plantations, but integrating and gradually growing the agroforestry environment helps us to bring in retired workers, helps us to integrate livelihoods, helps us to rebuild that natural ecosystem, that whether it is planting fruit trees as part of it or combining tea with other, whether it is durian or whether it is lychee or whatever the crops. Coffee is one fantastic example that is emerging now, fantastic opportunity for us to add value. In any of these environments, if you take agroforestry, or if you look in the blue carbon area, look at seaweed, the possibility for us to use Sri Lanka's natural environment to produce something that is environment friendly is a hackneyed term, but something that is that sequesters carbon, that is at the same time taking seaweed or grasses, marine seagrass, which could be, where you could add value. So, for example, if you look at seaweed, you can use it as fertilizer, low value addition. You can also build it up, as we did recently together with some Australian master chefs at the Genesis, where we looked at how you can be integrated into menus for chefs, high value addition. So taking a smallholder, and we are talking about 25, 30 families in this trial stage in the vicinity of the Jaffna Peninsula, and giving them a possibility to align with a market where there is high value addition. It's a fantastic opportunity, because then you're promoting innovation, you're really building an example of holistic economic development that addresses the polycrisis. We need to include women. We need to ensure that there is biodiversity, conservation, and restoration. And all of this, and of course, education, innovation, the list goes on. Just look at the SDGs and you will see from those 17 which we need to address, and basically all of them. So I think in this sense, for us, it's agroforestry on the plantations. It's nature-based solutions, understanding and relaying these nature-based solutions to our colleagues in industry, because there's no sense in 1, 2, or 10 businesses doing it. We need to build a coalition for environmental good. And ultimately, like the Singapore example, environmental good is where the good of the country, the future of the country, the jobs, the competitive advantage lie. Remember, we have a small resource base. Sri Lanka is not a market like in India, where we can say domestically we can transform our economy. We don't have the resources. So when you talk about tea, we are a high-cost industry, simply because of the reality of labor, reality of our soils, and the reality of the heritage of the industry. And so if we say, look, let's bring in agroforestry, the first warning is going to come from people who will say, okay, you're going to lose output. Yes, but wouldn't it be better for Sri Lanka to produce 150 million kilos of tea at a level of value addition that sustains our people, sustains our environment, sustains tourism, than to produce 300 million at an unsustainable level where we continue to be prone to drought, and which ultimately, nature will decide, and we, with that 300 million, will very soon end up at below 150. So I think the opportunity is there. I've only given 2 examples, but there's a ton of them. And that is the solution as Singapore has realized.
So I think picking up from something Dilhan said, I just want to ask both Sonali and Dr. Jasinghe. Sonali, Dilhan subtly pointed to this idea of trade-offs, right? There are trade-offs. And some, I think, believe that we should focus more on what we're going to lose in that trade-off, or what could potentially be lost in that trade-off, that there's a cost to taking a nature positive approach. There's a cost to a green growth path, but we're compromising on more output that we may have got, or faster growth that we could have got, or production that we could have got today, because the economy is struggling, people are struggling. How would you respond to that in helping people think of this trade-off differently, helping people to think of these pressures on today versus tomorrow? Nature can actually contribute to driving more inclusive economic growth, rather than seeing it as having to compromise on faster growth, better incomes, in the spirit of gaining nature.
I guess in a nutshell, I would say that we really need to be thinking of that longer term paradigm shift. We can't be thinking of short term gains as a country. especially right now at this critical juncture when we are going through this economic recovery. It's very easy, and also we're in an election year, it's very easy for folks to think of a short-term gain. But I believe that we really do need to be thinking in the long term. And certainly there are trade-offs, but the idea is to see how to assess those trade-offs using, there are various different ways that can be done. For example, GGGI has a green growth index that it uses, measuring green growth across a number of indicators in countries that look and try and measure these quantitatively, to measure some of these trade-offs. The idea is to be aware of the trade-offs and understand how those trade-offs could be minimized and who would be impacted. The other point I would like to say, Anush, is that ultimately we need to look at how these different issues and these different crises are interconnected, and we have to basically, make sure that we are connecting the dots. So while we could, in an isolated way, think of it as a trade-off between one or the other, development versus conservation, which is a very archaic way of looking at it, and most countries have moved way beyond that. I think the idea is to understand that, as Dilhan also pointed out, and so did Dr. Jasinghe, all these things are interconnected. So for example, if you're going for a short-term gain, and if you are, of course, in this crisis situation, looking immediately in terms of food security and poverty alleviation, which is critical given the hardships, particularly vulnerable communities have been facing in the country, we need to also make sure we don't, take the foot off the pressure in terms of things like climate action, because our country is also vulnerable to climate change. So you could have, as Dilhan mentioned, you could have flash floods, you could have droughts, which are in that way impacting our agricultural sector as well. So that also has a knock-on effect in terms of poverty alleviation. So if you don't really look at all of this in a holistic way and think of it in the long-term gains, you're really going to end up in a situation where you're not actually solving things. You're just making, short-term solutions that are not really sustainable in the long term.
So, Dr. Jasinghe, this question of interlinkages, that there are, Dilhan also pointed out that even in the SDGs, there's so many interlinkages to nature. As Sonali is also mentioning, this economic recovery, there are linkages between the poverty and livelihood pressures out of the economic crisis, the nutrition and income-related pressures out of COVID and the economic crisis, our exports, trade, all of those, there are interlinkages. You're a veteran in the public sector in Sri Lanka. To what extent do you think that these interlinkages are well understood in the public sector, public policy making? And have you seen attempts to try and any initiatives or examples where there's an attempt to slowly bring these together? Because it's a tough one, trying to demonstrate the interlinkages and work in a more interdisciplinary way.
Yeah, actually understanding interlinkages are very important. That's basically, if you take climate action, it's about interlinkages. The adaptation and mitigation, it's about interlinkages. That's why I said, this is overarching. This doesn't, remain in one sector. If you take, numerically, we have 15 sectors, working on adaptation and mitigation, for example. Now, I think it's very important to say that, this climate action and the green growth, you have to look in terms of medium term and long term, both. And of course, when you think of long term, it may not be attractive, at the outset, but then there are low hanging fruits, right? So that's where we have to concentrate. And also, just imagine, we have to realize that this is a nature abundant country, right? If just imagine if we can restore the village tank cascade system in this country, right? Which is now in shatters, right? So that's actually even now, even in current the terms, it is considered as a remarkable the solution for adaptation in climate change, and it's about water conservation, right? And then about as Sonali said, the agriculture, right? We have to go for smart agriculture, right? That's the only way that you could preserve water, and then going for various crops, right? Climate resistant crops, right? So export crops. So those are there. Of course, then there are major areas of investments with regard to green growth. That's about forests, for example. Now, in conventionally, forest conservation, we think that the government we sort of by legal this thing, we the conserve forest. That's good. Sri Lanka has been successful. But future is not this, future is that through forest conservation we can bring in money. There are methods we can bring in a lot of capital through forest conservation, right? And then what about the paddy farming, right? When you take paddy farming, we use a lot of water, right? So globally there are methods, the systems, instruments where you can reduce the carbon, the methane emissions, and then the benefit to go to the farmers as well, through carbon credits, right? So through credits. So there are a lot of ways, but as you said, we have to understand interlinkages, and we have to understand where the problems are there, where the hindrances, and then we have to slowly remove barriers. And then and climate advocacy is very important. Without climate, if farmer doesn't understand that he would benefit more by using less water, there are methods, right? He will never change, right? So one thing is climate advocacy, and then the piloting these things, and then showcase, and that is how I think we have to move forward. Of course, there are lots of initiatives taken by Sri Lanka, and working with international organizations, including GGGI. So we are working on many things like green bonds, and we had attempted net for nature, but then we couldn't do that at the first round. So now the green bond framework is in shape somewhat. So that is actually, just imagine the issuance of green bonds is for climate action. That is harnessing capital for climate action. So there are ways and means globally and locally that we could, get the capital for green growth, and then also for the community to understand, and of course the governors, the bureaucrats, and the technocrats to realize that this would work.
So, because you brought up the point about financing, I want to turn to Sonali and also to Dilhan. Sonali, if you can just very briefly help our audience understand this linkage between finance and natural capital conservation, finding new sources of financing for nature positive economic activity. Because frankly, I feel that, and this is some work that CSF has done, engaging with both the economics and finance community, but also the conservation, ecology, environmental science community, when there was this talk about new sovereign instruments linked to nature, green bonds, blue bonds, debt for nature swaps. We released a few primers, and some of the feedback was there is distrust. We know that the capital is out there. We know that there is nature in abundance, but there is distrust in how these instruments will work. Sri Lanka doesn't have a very good track record of managing debt. So, and also on the private sector side, I feel that it's still being seen very narrowly. We have a panel as part of the series on green finance over this week. And it's still seen as green finance is getting low-cost money to then lend to, say, just renewables. But what all of you are talking about is much broader than that. What Dr. Jasinghe talked about is really seeing natural capital as a new asset class, finding, truly meaningful environmental objectives and getting capital for that. Where are we at right now on that, and how can we bridge this somewhat of a disconnect, distrust on how capital and the traditional world of finance can actually support preserving and enhancing natural capital?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point. And drawing on what Dr. Jasinghe said, I think particularly because Sri Lanka is in the juncture that we are, going through this economic recovery, we do need to explore all these instruments that are out there and that have been actually quite successful in other countries. So I would say it's really good to note that there is some distrust, and the sense is how to really address that. I would say one is perhaps drawing on some of the examples from out there that have been relatively successful, at least for the moment, and maybe creating a better sense of awareness of how those have worked in other countries. For example, GGGI was recently part of a consortium working on a debt for nature swap in Ecuador, which included actually the Galapagos Marine Protected Area. So the idea was to ring fence a certain amount of funding that goes specifically for conservation of that marine protected area. So sometimes with the terminology as well, there is a sense of fearing that you are selling your natural capital to other countries, rather than the fact that you might be gaining finances to support you in protecting that in situ in your country. So I think this is an area where certainly the climate change initiatives coming through the Presidential Secretariat, the Ministry of Finance is working on these very closely with the Ministry of Environment, needs to take from the government perspective, needs to take a lead, working also with think tanks like yourself, Anush, and other development partners like GGGI, and there are others in this space as well, to pull together material and also consultations with different groups to create a better sense of awareness and also have dialogue, because not everyone is going to agree with everything you say. And then I guess it's those tension points where you need to do a deep dive to understand why are certain stakeholders extremely fearful about certain aspects of some of these instruments, and see how best we can tackle those specific pressure points. I would say that's one way forward.
Right. Dilhan, also, I think from the private sector perspective, we don't want the private sector to cut corners and thinking that this is a new source of funding, new source of capital that we can get to do things that we couldn't do before, or cheaper sources of capital. So my question really is, to what extent does our private sector, you feel, even observationally, truly understand these concepts of natural capital, nature positivity, rather going beyond the buzzwords around the carbon credits, the biodiversity credits, the green bonds, and so on. So, do you feel that the private sector is ready? Do they truly understand what it means to treat this as a natural asset, as genuine, authentic conservation, nature positive approaches, rather than just seeing it as, hey, the moment sovereign re-rating happens, this is going to be a new way for us to get in some cheaper sources of credit?
There are a few inspiring examples of insightful thinking from the private sector. But unfortunately, there is also a lot of inertia, which is there is some sort of cognitive bias associated with the transition to a more nature positive form. But yet, look at the opportunities. The most recent one, the president, I'm sure with Dr. Jasinghe's facilitation, entered into an agreement with Singapore for carbon credits. Now, taking a history of that kind of association, but Singapore's Gen Zero Temasek affiliate,
yes.
what they did in Ghana, in the I think the Kwahu region, was inspiring. 100,000 acres restored, but importantly, it wasn't just the environmental restoration, it's creating a productive, natural, environmental, economic ecosystem. And so it regenerated not just the environment. It wasn't just biodiversity, but they were looking at the livelihoods. They addressed gender. They addressed all of those elements, or significant number of those elements, in this so-called polycrisis. So I think the private sector doesn't yet understand, but I can't blame the private sector, because there's been a lot of confusion around it. And some of the things that what Sonali mentioned now, what GGGI together with the government, the Climate Change Secretariat are doing is fantastic, because it'll bring clarity. Private sector has a lot on its mind right now. And so, of course, they've got an excuse. But unfortunately, nature positive or not, it's a foregone conclusion.
With that note, I want to bring it to the last round of our conversation, and this is really about looking forward, looking at priorities. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Jasinghe, because there's a lot of activity happening at a policy level. This is also an election year. You deal a lot with policymakers and so on. So what more can be done to make policymakers and politicians truly understand what is at stake if we don't go down this journey, and making them understand that this is not an option. It is not, a nice to have, maybe we can also do this as part of other promises. And so what more can we do to make them truly understand this and drive that critical message of we need to rethink our growth model?
One thing is, we have globally committed, we have global commitments in our net zero, in our NDC, right? That have all been pledged by the government, the policymakers, right? And this discussion shows that there is enormous potential for green growth, right? But you see now, we must not do anything behind the back of people, right? So, for example, if you say mangrove, right? Enormous potential, right? Seagrass, right? If we think in terms of developing carbon pricing, carbon market, carbon trading in terms of mangrove or forest conservation, what I see is we must auction, or we must, tender, right? Because what we see is like in any other field, we see that, various entities, various traders, who are interested, come to us, right? In the meantime, we must not forget that there is a thing called greenwashing, right? And even in carbon trade, there are certain loopholes, right? So we have to see what is best for the country. When you see what is best for the country, I think the credibility issues will be very much less. The policymakers will understand, the bureaucrats, the technocrats, and especially the community. Because we ultimately, whatever the green growth, work, we have to do with the community, because it's on the ground. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, Now we are actually the one thing is the government is responsible for governance of green growth, the governance, right? And on one hand, the government has to facilitate. Once again, we have certain fiscal difficulties, but then we have to see while we are working internationally, locally, what can the government do to facilitate green growth? For example, I don't know, we have to think how we could work on for example, carbon tax, right? Because we need capital for the green growth. If there's no capital for green growth, we can't work it out. And of course, we will certainly depend on externalities. We call the conditional support. But in the meantime, we must show our internal the drive towards the green growth. So that's one area. Of course, it's too premature to go for emission trading systems. Like it takes some 10 years, but then we can start from low-hanging fruits like, for example, carbon taxing, right? That's about the emitters. And now we are working with on green bond framework, and then also with regard to carbon trading, we are still not fully ready. Now we need to work on the for example legislation, and then we have to work on carbon trading framework. Now we are working on those things, but it takes little time. You can't do these things overnight. So I think that is what from the theoretical and from certain other legislative this thing. Now we have to come into these nitty-gritty issues.
So, Dr. Jasinghe, you pointed out a very important priority, which is going from the ideas and the concepts to now really putting in place the policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks to make it happen and do it responsibly, meaningfully, and credibly, which I think is a big priority. Sonali, turning to you for this last round, what are some other priorities that you would point to in strengthening the adoption of nature and environmental considerations in this economic post-economic crisis, economic recovery phase for Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I think one would be supporting in terms of capacity building, which is one thing that in terms of providing technical assistance and capacity building as a result of that, which is one thing that GGGI does. So as mentioned by Dr. Jasinghe, for example, Sri Lanka does not have a carbon trading framework. Now, GGGI, in our work, we have a carbon trading facility, a platform that's been set up for both buyers and sellers, member countries, to come together and have dialogues about this kind of issue. And one thing we will be doing based on a request from the Presidential Secretariat as well as the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment is providing some capacity building in terms of Article 6. So because actually it's pretty complicated in terms of how it works. So the capacity building in the case of what we are doing is actually with the technical folks working in these different ministries to give them a better understanding of how that works. Because without that capacity to develop the framework, etc., Sri Lanka can't actually move ahead or even understand whether it should move ahead or not. So providing that. Another thing is, I think, again, building on what Dr. Jasinghe said, is collective action is really important. So it's not just working with the government and the private sector, but also working, for example, with civil society organizations, NGOs, etc., who are a very dynamic stakeholder group in our country, and understanding how best to bring together these different stakeholder groups in terms of a transformative move in regard to green growth of the country. So collective action and how to move forward to do that. That would be something I think is important. The other thing is, again, sort of building on what Dr. Jasinghe said, is working not just at the national level, but also working at a community level or even the provincial level for that matter. So for example, looking at the NDCs and the national adaptation plans, we are working on provincial adaptation plans, which are really being localized and nuanced in terms of what kind of sustainable adaptation interventions need to take place at a more local level, and ensuring that those interventions also don't end up in maladaptation. So you don't want something you think is providing a positive outcome to end up actually really negatively impacting certain vulnerable groups. So really looking into that kind of thing. So not just at the national level, but looking beyond that at the local level. And I do think that particularly at this juncture, we do need to look at these different instruments that we've been talking about in terms of sustainable finance, taking on board that there are some concerns in some quarters and some stakeholder groups. And the idea would be to really tackle that front and center, to understand why different stakeholders may have certain concerns, and to see how we can move forward in that light in terms of addressing those concerns or understanding and taking on board different perspectives as well. So I think using these new instruments that we've been talking about today would be important for Sri Lanka if we are to move ahead, not just in the trajectory that we were supposed to go, but really look at new trajectories that we can, embark on, because we have this opportunity now, this critical time in the country where we need to move forward. And finally, I think, like linked with the collective action, I think the private sector has a huge role to play here. The government cannot do everything on its own. And there are champions like Dilhan in the private sector. And there are others as well who are championing this, but really bringing on board the private sector more in terms of climate action as well as this nature positive or biodiversity gains is critical. And there are already platforms that are doing that. And Dilhan is involved in some of those, I know. But it's really like bringing it all together to understand that all these different aspects, for example, the biodiversity or nature angle, the climate action angle, the economic crisis, these are all interlinked. So when we are actually addressing the problem, again, I mentioned this before, stay away from working in silos and understand how these interlinkages and using a more integrated and interdisciplinary approach moving forward would be critical, I think.
Just to interrupt now moving on to private sector, there are certain windows of opportunities. Now, for example, blended financing, right? So the private sector can look into the opportunities of blended financing. And then there is a window for private sector in the GCF, the Global Climate Fund, right? So those things. And then, of course, PPP, public-private partnership. And then, of course, as I said, they can chip in the carbon pricing, right? And then the ESG performances. I know that, when it comes to industries, the greening of industries has become essential now. And EU is supporting in a big way. So with our support or without our support, we see that some industries like your own industry, they're working on this thing. One thing for the benefit of the country and also for benefit of their own enterprise.
So, Dilhan, we heard a lot now about the private sector, and since we often hear politicians and policymakers say the private sector is in the engine of growth and so on, let me end with you around the private sector role. So, there are so many opportunities for private sector funding, private sector new business opportunities. We also heard about risks around greenwashing. We don't want this to be that next thing that we skimp on and we just make perfunctory efforts. We don't just change a logo to have a stripe of green on it. How ready is the private sector, you think, to be really rigorous about this? And how can we do more to bring that rigor in, to get the private sector to really think now, this is no longer just CSR. This is no longer one part of your sustainability report or one little item saying we're meeting some targets, to truly see this as integrated in their business model. If you had to point to one or two things that you feel could, take us into a new era of how Sri Lankan private sector thinks about it. Is it regulation? Is it international competitive pressure? Is it just good businesses, good entrepreneurs just doing good things? What would it be?
I'm thrilled to hear Dr. Jasinghe's position on the government's position rather on prioritizing the framework, the infrastructure required. But as he also said, we have the opportunity. Since 2005 and the British government's Stern report, we knew exactly what needed to be done. We knew the fact that mitigation would be a far less costly option than facing climate change. And so possibly what is going to make a change is awareness and acceptance, which is why I emphasize these two publications by economists, which present the argument in a very compelling way. But then seeing what is happening around us, whether it is at the last COP or currently the WEF, you see a multitude of examples of practical action that are required. So for the private sector, there are multiple impact ESG investment opportunities which hinge on collaboration. We need to hinge our effort at accessing the climate finance that could unlock tremendous natural value in Sri Lanka through collaboration. We need to build partnerships with universities to ensure that there is certain scientific basis to our claim. You can't just go and say, look, I planted 10,000 trees, give me some cash. It doesn't work like that. You've got to do your baseline surveys. It's got to be according to certain criteria. It has to be internationally acceptable. And with that in hand, there are a multitude of opportunities and there are growing opportunities. And so right now, partnerships with international agencies require the local validation. And that can be done quite easily because in Sri Lanka, we have the universities that can deliver that. So I think collaboration, I would add to what was already stated as critical for us to be able to unlock this value.
Thank you, Dilhan Fernando, of the chair of Dilmah, Dr. Sonali Sellamuttu, country representative of the Global Green Growth Institute, Dr. Anil Jasinghe, now CEO of the new Climate Change Office and also Senior Additional Secretary to the President's Office. Thank you very much. We had a fantastic discussion that crisscrossed, the need for now moving from the ideas around biodiversity credits, carbon credits, to actually getting the regulatory framework right to address some of the concerns around these instruments. The points around seeing those interlinkages, seeing that taking a more nature positive approach is actually beneficial for the economic recovery. It doesn't have to stand alone. And Dilhan, making a very strong case for the private sector to get more rigorous, get more meaningful and credible around taking this approach, and that there's lots of investment and capital opportunities out there. So thank you very much to all of you, and we hope our audience joins us for the rest of this series where we delve into other aspects around nature positive business models, green finance, and so on. So thank you very much.